The auditorium was filled with bright lights, the sound of families whispering, and the rustle of graduation gowns. It was a day of joy, a day of pride, a day that every parent dreams of. But for Sergeant Marcus Johnson, it was more than that. This day was the result of years of sacrifice, lonely nights, and battles fought both on the battlefield and at home. Marcus walked into the hall wearing his Marine Corps uniform. The dark blue fabric was pressed sharp, the medals on his chest shining like tiny stars. Each medal told a story of courage, of pain, of loyalty. People turned their heads as he walked by. Some looked at him with admiration, others with curiosity. But Marcus didn't notice any of them. His eyes were only searching for one person, his son, David. David had worked hard to get here. He wasn't just graduating. He was graduating with honors. For Marcus, seeing his son succeed was the greatest victory of his life. He had missed birthdays, school plays, and family dinners while serving overseas. But today he was here. Today, nothing would stop him from watching his boy walk across that stage. As Marcus found his seat in the front row, he let out a small breath. For the first time in months, he felt peace. His son would look into the crowd and see him there standing tall, a father who never gave up. Marcus's hand brushed over the invitation in his pocket, the official ticket that proved he belonged here. He had checked it twice before coming, just to be sure. But deep inside, Marcus carried a weight. Being a black Marine, he had faced prejudice countless times in his career. He had been doubted, questioned, even disrespected, despite his rank and achievements. He told himself today would be different. Today was about David, not about him. Yet something in his chest whispered caution. The ceremony began with music. Graduates filed in, rows of young men and women in shining caps and gowns. Proud parents leaned forward, cameras flashing, eyes shining with tears. Marcus felt his throat tighten. His son was there, standing tall, his steps confident. He looked so much like his late mother, with the same determined eyes. Marcus clenched his hands together, trying to hold back the flood of emotions. The principal gave a long speech about success and the future. People clapped, cheered, and shouted their children's names. Marcus clapped too, but his heart beat faster. He couldn't wait for David's turn. Every second felt heavy. He imagined the moment his son's name would be called, the proud salute he would give in return. Then, as Marcus adjusted in his seat, he felt a shadow fall over him. Two uniformed security guards approached, their faces stiff, their eyes cold. One leaned down and asked, "Sir, can we see your ticket?" Marcus nodded calmly, sliding the invitation out of his pocket. "Of course," he said, his voice firm but polite. He handed it over, sure that everything was fine. The guard glanced at the paper, then exchanged a look with his partner. Something was wrong in their eyes, something Marcus had seen before. The second guard spoke. "This section is reserved for family only." Marcus's chest tightened. He answered, "I am family. I'm his father." His tone carried no doubt, no hesitation, but the guards didn't believe him. One of them gave a short laugh, almost mocking. "Right. And I suppose you just happened to show up in uniform for attention?" The words cut like a knife. Marcus kept his composure, but his jaw clenched. He had fought for this country, bled for it, and now, here in the middle of his son's graduation, he was being treated like a stranger. He looked around. Parents were watching, whispering. Some frowned in confusion, others turned away uncomfortably. Marcus felt the heat of humiliation, but he refused to move. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly, his voice low but steady. "I have every right to be here." The guards stiffened, their hands twitching near his arm. The tension grew thick, pressing down on the room like a heavy weight. In the distance, Marcus's son stepped onto the stage, unaware of the storm building just below. And that was how it began, the moment of pride turning into a moment of injustice. Marcus had come to watch his son graduate, but what awaited him was something he had faced all his life. Doubt, suspicion, and the cruel hand of prejudice, yet this time, something different was about to happen. Something that would silence the entire room. The crowd inside the auditorium was still clapping for the graduates on stage, but near the front row, the atmosphere was shifting. Marcus Johnson sat tall in his Marine uniform, but the two guards loomed over him, their voices sharp, their tone filled with authority. "Sir, we told you this section is reserved," the first guard said again, louder this time as if wanting others to hear. "We need you to move." Marcus's dark eyes lifted, calm but unyielding. "I will not move." My son is graduating today and I'm sitting right here to watch him." His voice was steady, filled with the kind of discipline only years in the military could create. But the guard scoffed. "Listen, don't make this difficult. If you don't leave, we'll have to escort you out. Don't cause a scene." The irony of those words hit Marcus like a cruel joke. "'Cause a scene?" He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved aggressively. Yet here he was, being treated like a troublemaker, like a stranger in his own son's celebration. People sitting nearby began to notice. Mothers clutched their purses. Fathers whispered to one another. Some children pointed curiously at the Marine in the front row. Marcus could feel every eye on him. The humiliation stung, but he kept his shoulders square, his jaw tight. One woman leaned toward her husband and asked, "Is he really the father? Why are they asking him to leave?" The husband shrugged, shaking his head, unwilling to speak up. The guards pressed harder. "Sir, last warning." "Stand up." Marcus didn't flinch. He had faced combat zones, mortar fire, and missions where every second meant life or death. Compared to that, 2 guards in pressed uniforms didn't scare him. "You don't get to decide if I belong here," Marcus said firmly. "My son's name is David Johnson. He's graduating today, and I am his father." The second guard smirked, folding his arms. "Everyone says that. You think you're the first man to try and sneak into an event like this?" Marcus blinked slowly. That sentence carried the weight of insult. Sneak in? Him? A man who had given half his life to serve this country? A man who had stood in deserts and jungles far away from home, so these same guards could live in peace? Still, he didn't rise to anger. That was his training. He knew losing his temper would only prove their twisted view of him. So he breathed slowly, in and out, gripping the armrest of his seat. But the guards weren't satisfied. One reached forward, touching his shoulder as if to pull him up. That single touch sent a wave of fire through Marcus's chest. He froze, his mind flashing back to combat missions where every sudden grab could mean life or death. "Remove your hand," Marcus said in a voice so low, so firm, that the guard actually stepped back for a moment. The strength in his tone carried years of authority, the voice of a Marine who had commanded men in battle. But pride, mixed with ignorance, fueled the guard. He puffed his chest and snapped, "That's it. You're out." The whispers grew louder now. The audience could sense something was wrong. People leaned forward in their seats, staring. Some pulled out phones, ready to record. David, still waiting in his row of graduates, looked over and saw the movement near his father. His face paled, confusion filling his eyes. From the stage, the principal noticed too. His speech faltered, but he quickly turned back to the microphone, pretending nothing was happening. Marcus's heart ached. Not for himself, but for his son. This is David's day, he thought. This is supposed to be his moment, not mine. But injustice has a way of finding the most painful times to strike. The first guard leaned close again, his voice cold. "You heard me. Leave, or we'll drag you out." For the first time, Marcus's composure cracked. His lips pressed together, his eyes darkened, and his voice sharpened. "I've been dragged through enemy lines. I've been dragged through fire and mud for this country. But I will never, never be dragged away from my son's graduation." The words rang like thunder. Even the people sitting several rows behind heard it. A hush spread over part of the crowd. Some parents lowered their cameras, sensing history in the making. Still, the guards stood firm, unaware of the storm they had unleashed. Marcus sat back slowly, his chest rising and falling. He looked straight ahead at the stage, refusing to give them the satisfaction of his eyes. Inside, he was holding on to the last thread of patience, knowing something bigger was about to happen, and indeed it was. For while the guards believed they held the power, they had no idea who else sat in that auditorium. They had no idea that a group of men, scattered quietly among the audience, had already noticed what was happening. Men who carried their own scars, their own medals, their own brotherhood. They were watching, waiting, and soon they would rise. The air inside the auditorium grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The guards stood with rigid postures, their hands close to Marcus, but the Marine remained unmoved. His broad shoulders stayed square, his eyes fixed on the stage. He wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. "Sir," the taller guard repeated with forced authority. "Stand up right now. This is the last time we're going to ask." Marcus did not move. Instead, He placed his hands calmly on his knees and replied in a tone that carried both patience and steel. "You can ask 100 times. My answer will not change. I will not leave my son." The shorter guard's jaw tightened. He leaned down so close Marcus could feel his breath. "You're making a mistake." Marcus finally turned his head, meeting his eyes directly. His gaze was calm but unbreakable. "No," he said firmly. "The mistake is yours." The guard stepped back, unsettled. He hadn't expected such quiet strength. Most people would have caved under that kind of pressure, especially with hundreds of eyes watching. But Marcus Johnson was not most people. The audience, once cheerful, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered. Others pulled out phones, recording the standoff. A few parents frowned at the guards, recognizing something deeply wrong. But none dared to stand up. On stage, David spotted the commotion. His chest tightened as he realized the guards were confronting his father. His proud smile faded. His fists clenched at his sides, anger boiling beneath his skin. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, but humiliation now threatened to drown it. One of the guards reached for Marcus again, trying to grab his arm. The Marine's voice thundered through the hall. "Don't touch me!" The words weren't shouted, but the power in them echoed like a command given in battle. The entire row in front flinched. The guard froze, his hand suspended mid-air. Silence fell over the nearby seats. Even the sound of the principal's speech on stage seemed faint compared to the storm brewing in the front row. Marcus's mind raced. He had endured worse. Ambushes, firefights, moments where survival meant trusting his instincts. But this was different. This was about his son, about dignity, about years of being treated as if he didn't belong. He closed his eyes for half a second and breathed. "Stay calm, Marcus. Stay steady." For David, the guard, humiliated by being halted, tried again. "If you don't leave, we will remove you by force." "You're disrupting the ceremony." Marcus's head snapped toward him. "No, you are the disruption. You dishonor this moment by trying to tear a father away from his child." His words carried across the hall. People gasped. Some nodded silently, feeling the weight of his truth. Others shifted nervously, afraid of being pulled into the conflict. David's chest heaved as he whispered to the classmate beside him, "That's my dad." His voice cracked with both pride and fury. The guards exchanged frustrated looks. They had underestimated the man they were trying to control. His voice carried authority far greater than theirs, and they could sense the crowd slowly turning. But instead of stepping back, they doubled down. "Final warning," the taller guard barked. "Either you walk out or we drag you out. Right now." Marcus stood slowly, not in surrender, but in defiance. His full height towered over the guards, his uniform glinting under the bright auditorium lights. Every scar on his face, every line carved by years of service spoke of battles fought and victories earned. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't shout. He simply stood looking directly at them. "If you lay a single hand on me," he said coldly, "you will regret it for the rest of your life." The audience went still. Mothers gasped. Fathers muttered under their breath. Children stared wide-eyed at the Marine who stood like a mountain, before two guards who suddenly looked very small. The guards hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty cracked their armor. But before they could act again, something stirred in the back rows. 6 men shifted in their seats. They weren't sitting together, but each of them moved almost in unison as though connected by an invisible bond. They were dressed in plain clothes, jeans, jackets, shirts, but their posture gave them away. Straight backs, steady eyes, the quiet readiness of men trained for war. They had been watching since the beginning, and now they had seen enough. The first SEAL rose to his feet, his presence immediately felt across the room. A second stood seconds later, then a third, a fourth, until all 6 stood like shadows towering over the crowd. The guards didn't notice at first, but the audience did. Heads turned, murmurs spread. The silence of the room deepened, waiting for what would come next. And Marcus, he didn't even turn around. He already knew. He could feel it in his bones. His brothers in arms were here. What the guards thought was their moment of control was about to end. The silence would soon be broken, not by shouting, not by fists, but by the presence of warriors who had no patience for disrespect. The SEALs were about to make themselves known. The air inside the auditorium grew heavier with every passing second. Parents whispered to each other. Cameras hovered uncertainly. And the graduates on stage began to notice the tension spreading like wildfire through the room. At the center of it all stood Marcus Johnson, a Marine who had fought for his country, now fighting silently for the right to watch his son graduate. The two guards still blocked him, their faces tight with frustration. "Move," the taller guard snapped, his voice echoing louder than before. "This is the last time we ask." Marcus didn't blink. His chest rose and fell steadily, his calm more unnerving than any display of anger. "You will not take this moment from me," he said firmly, his words steady as stone. The shorter guard's patience broke. He reached forward, grabbing Marcus's arm. The instant his hand touched the Marine, a wave of gasps filled the front rows. People rose from their seats, straining to see what would happen. Marcus didn't strike back. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his eyes dark and cold. In a voice low enough for the guard to feel in his bones, he said, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The guard's grip faltered. His fingers loosened as if instinct warned him that pressing further would be a mistake. But pride forced him to hold on. Up on stage, David froze. His classmates were clapping for the student whose name had just been called, but David didn't join them. His eyes were locked on his father, his jaw tight. He whispered under his breath, "Dad." His voice cracked, though no one on stage heard. The principal, sensing the disruption, paused mid-speech. He cleared his throat nervously, then forced a smile, pretending nothing was wrong. But his eyes betrayed his unease, darting toward the commotion. The guards tried again, tugging harder at Marcus. The Marine's boots scraped slightly against the polished floor, but he refused to move. His legs were like pillars rooted deep, immovable. And then it happened. One man in the back row stood. His broad shoulders and sharp eyes drew immediate attention. He didn't shout, didn't gesture wildly. He simply stood there, his posture commanding silence. A second man rose a moment later, then a third. By the time the sixth stood, the audience had gone completely quiet. The 6 men were dressed like ordinary guests, some in jackets, some in casual shirts, but nothing about them was ordinary. Their eyes were too focused, their stance too precise. Anyone who had ever served in the military would recognize them immediately. These were warriors. These were U.S. Navy SEALs. The guards finally noticed the sudden shift in the room. They glanced around nervously, their hands still on Marcus. Whispers rippled through the crowd like electricity. "Who are they? Why are they standing? They look like soldiers." The first SEAL began walking down the aisle. His steps were calm, measured, unhurried. But every eye followed him, as though gravity itself pulled the room toward his presence. The others followed behind, fanning out like shadows moving with purpose. Marcus stood tall, his arm still gripped by the guard. He didn't look back, but his lips curled into the faintest smile. He knew. He could feel the bond, the unspoken brotherhood. The taller guard, trying to mask his unease, barked, "Sit down, all of you. This doesn't concern you." His voice cracked at the end, betraying his fear. But the SEALs didn't stop. They kept walking, their eyes locked on Marcus and the men who dared to lay hands on him. The tension became unbearable. Children stopped fidgeting. Parents forgot to breathe. Even the graduates on stage turned their heads, captivated by the unfolding scene. David's eyes filled with tears. He had always admired his father's strength, but now he saw something even greater. His father was not alone. He had brothers, men who would stand for him when others tried to tear him down. As the SEALs approached, the guards shifted uncomfortably. Their grip on Marcus weakened. One whispered nervously, "Who are these guys?" The answer came not in words, but in presence. The SEALs stopped just a few feet away, their bodies forming a silent wall. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than any threat. The audience held its breath. Phones rose higher, recording history. The hall that had moments ago been filled with celebration was now gripped by suspense so thick it was almost unbearable. The shorter guard finally released Marcus's arm, stepping back slightly. The taller one hesitated, his pride refusing to let go, but his eyes darted nervously between the Marine and the 6 men watching him like hawks. Marcus finally turned his head, meeting the gaze of the SEALs. For the first time that day, his eyes softened. He gave them a small nod, a silent thank you, a recognition of loyalty that words could never capture. The SEALs didn't nod back. They didn't move. They simply stood there, their silence speaking louder than anything else. The entire auditorium had gone quiet. Even the principal stopped pretending to continue his speech. The room waited, the weight of justice pressing down on every soul present. And in that silence, everyone realized something. This was no longer about 2 guards and a Marine. This was about respect. This was about dignity. This was about a man who had given everything for his country, now being defended by the very brothers who knew his worth. The next moment would decide everything. The hall had fallen into complete silence. The graduates stood stiff on stage, the parents in the audience frozen, all eyes locked on the scene in the front row. 2 guards stood over Marcus, their pride still pushing them forward, but their confidence had already begun to crack. And then came the moment. One of the SEALs, a tall man with a shaved head and calm eyes, finally spoke. His voice was deep, commanding, and carried across the room with no need for a microphone. "Take your hands off him," he said. The words rolled like thunder. Simple, direct, unshakable. The taller guard stiffened, glancing nervously at the 6 men. "And who do you think you are?" He barked, trying to sound bold but failing. His voice wavered. The SEAL stepped closer, his boots echoing against the polished floor. "We're the men who served with him," he said. "We're the men who know him. And you're about to make the biggest mistake of your lives if you don't let go." Gasps ran through the audience. People whispered, their eyes darting between Marcus and the SEALs. The tension was suffocating, yet no one dared to look away. The shorter guard laughed nervously, shaking his head. "What, you expect us to believe this guy's some sort of hero?" The second SEAL, broader and scarred across one cheek, stepped forward now. His voice was sharper, colder. "He's not some sort of hero. He's the reason we're standing here today." The room grew even quieter. Mothers leaned forward. Fathers clutched their children's shoulders. They all wanted to hear. The guards faltered, but pride still clung to their words. "He hasn't shown us any proof he belongs here," one muttered, still clinging to the idea of control. That was when the third SEAL spoke, his tone edged with fire. "Proof? Look at his chest. Those medals aren't decorations, they're stories written in blood. That's proof enough." Marcus remained silent, standing tall, his eyes still fixed on the stage. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to draw attention. But his brothers in arms had spoken, and their voices carried the weight of truth. From the stage, David's chest swelled with emotion. His father had always been his hero, but now the world was seeing it too. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, "That's my dad." His classmates heard him this time. Some turned their heads, watching in awe. The guards shifted uneasily, their hands slowly lowering from Marcus. The taller one tried one last time to keep control. "This is a school ceremony. You men need to sit down before you ruin it." The fourth SEAL shook his head, his voice steady but sharp. "No, what ruins it is disrespecting a father on his son's proudest day. What ruins it is shaming a man who gave more to this country than you could ever imagine." A ripple of agreement moved through the audience. Parents began nodding, whispering, some even clapping quietly in support. The shift had begun. The guards were losing the room. The fifth SEAL, calm and measured, added his voice. "Do you know who this man is? This is Sergeant Marcus Johnson, Marine Corps, 20 years of service. He's been decorated for valor, for leadership, for saving lives that you'll never even know about." The whispers turned into audible gasps. People exchanged wide-eyed looks. Phones kept recording, capturing every word. The sixth SEAL, the youngest among them, stepped forward with fierce eyes. He pointed at Marcus. "That man dragged me out of a firefight when I thought my life was over. He didn't care about color, rank, or risk. He carried me on his back while bullets tore through the air. If he says he's a father here to see his son graduate, then you better believe it, because that man has never lied a day in his life." The crowd erupted. Applause broke out. Parents rising to their feet, clapping louder and louder until the whole auditorium shook with the sound. Some even shouted, "Let him stay." The guards were pale now, their pride shattered under the weight of the truth. They exchanged helpless glances, realizing they were not only outnumbered but outclassed. The taller guard finally stepped back, his voice small. We didn't know." The first SEAL's voice cut through the noise like steel. "That's the problem. You didn't want to know. You saw a black man in uniform and decided he didn't belong. But he belongs here more than anyone." The audience roared with agreement. Marcus finally turned, his deep voice steady. "Enough. He didn't want the day to turn into a battlefield. He didn't want his son's graduation remembered for conflict, but the truth had already spread. Everyone in the hall now understood who he was. Not just a Marine, not just a soldier, a father, a protector, a man who had earned his place with every breath. David's heart swelled with pride. On stage, his classmates clapped with the audience. Even the principal, his face pale with embarrassment, realized he could no longer stay silent. The SEALs closed ranks, forming a protective wall around Marcus. The guards melted back, powerless now, their authority stripped away. The noise of applause shook the auditorium, but Marcus remained calm, lifting his chin, his dignity intact, and yet, beneath the roar, the silence still waited. The story wasn't over. The final moment of justice had not yet come, because while the truth was spoken, the whole room would soon rise to its feet for something even greater. The roar of applause slowly faded, replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. Everyone in the auditorium was on their feet now except Marcus, who stood quietly at the center of the storm. The 6 SEALs remained around him, their presence unshakable, their eyes locked on the 2 guards who had dared to disrespect their brother. The guards, pale and trembling, stood frozen. Their pride had been stripped away like paper in a fire. They wanted to disappear, to melt into the crowd, but all eyes were still on them. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps. The principal, red-faced and sweating, rushed down the aisle from the stage. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he pushed his way through the stunned audience. He carried a clipboard in one hand, his tie swinging wildly as he stumbled toward the front. When he reached the scene, he forced a nervous smile, though his eyes betrayed his panic. "Gentlemen, please," he said loudly, his voice cracking. "This is a graduation ceremony. Let's not turn it into something else." The first SEAL turned his gaze toward the principal. His eyes were calm but sharp enough to cut through lies. "Something else?" he repeated. His voice was low, dangerous. This became something else the moment those guards tried to throw a father out of his son's graduation. The audience murmured in agreement, their whispers like waves crashing against the shore. The principal raised his hands as if to calm them, but the guilt on his face only grew heavier. Marcus finally moved, stepping forward slowly. His uniform glinted under the bright auditorium lights. He wasn't angry, but there was no mistaking the weight of his presence. "Principal," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I came here with my invitation." I sat down quietly, waiting to see my son walk across that stage. I wasn't here to fight. I wasn't here to make a scene. But your guards decided I didn't belong. The principal swallowed hard. "Sergeant Johnson, I assure you this was a misunderstanding." One of the SEALs laughed bitterly. "A misunderstanding," he said. "Funny how these misunderstandings always look the same. Always the same kind of man being told he doesn't belong." The silence that followed was sharper than a blade. Parents nodded quietly, some with tears in their eyes. David's classmates on stage shifted uncomfortably, their young faces suddenly confronted with the raw truth of the world outside their school walls. David himself stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes never left his father. He wanted to shout, to call out the injustice, but his voice caught in his throat. The shorter guard finally tried to speak, his voice small and weak. We didn't know he was important." The second SEAL's head snapped toward him. "Important?" His words dripped with fire. "Every father sitting in this room is important. Every parent deserves to be here. But this man, this Marine, he gave his life to protect yours. And you thought you had the right to throw him out?" The guard shrank back, his eyes darting to the floor. The principal's hands trembled. He looked at Marcus, then at the audience, then back again. "Sergeant Johnson," he said quickly, "please accept our apology. You are welcome here." "Of course you are." Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood silently, breathing slowly, letting the weight of the moment linger. Then finally he gave a small nod. "I'm not here for an apology," he said. "I'm here for my son." Those words hit the audience like a wave. Applause erupted again, louder than before. Some people shouted Marcus's name. Others cheered through tears. The sound shook the auditorium walls. David felt his chest tighten. His heart raced with pride so strong it hurt. That was his father. That was the man who had raised him. The man who never backed down. His throat burned with emotion as he whispered, "That's my dad." The SEALs didn't move, but their eyes softened. They had made their point. The guards lowered their heads, shame burning on their faces. The principal, desperate to regain control, raised his hands again. "Please, everyone, please. Let's return to the ceremony. We still have graduates to honor." His voice wavered, his authority broken, but the show had to go on. Marcus lowered himself back into his seat, the SEALs flanking him like a living shield. The crowd slowly sat down too, but the air was different now. No one looked at him with doubt anymore. They looked with respect, with awe, with shame for having doubted even for a moment that he belonged. The guards quietly slipped toward the exit, their heads hung low, their shoulders slumped in defeat. No one clapped for them. No one defended them. They disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by their own disgrace. The room was his now, not because Marcus demanded it, but because the truth demanded it, and yet the story wasn't over. The silence that followed held something bigger still. For when David's name was finally called, the entire room would rise again, but this time for both father and son. The ceremony continued, but nothing felt the same. Every student who walked across the stage glanced toward the front row, where Marcus sat surrounded by the SEALs. He had not asked for attention, yet he had become the silent center of it all. The principal tried to continue his speech with forced cheer, his words tripping over themselves, but the audience wasn't listening. Their minds were still replaying what had just happened. A proud father almost thrown out, rescued not by force, but by loyalty and truth. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. "David Johnson," the announcer called. The name rang through the hall like a bell. David's legs felt heavy as he stepped forward. His heart pounded, not because of the stage lights or the crowd, but because of what had just happened to his father. He walked slowly, his head held high, his eyes fixed on the front row where Marcus sat. The silence was deafening. No one clapped. No one cheered. The entire auditorium seemed frozen in anticipation. And then, it happened. David stopped at the center of the stage, turned toward his father, and raised his hand in a sharp salute. His movements were crisp, disciplined, filled with respect. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The young son saluting his father, the Marine who had sacrificed so much. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a message. "You are my hero. This diploma belongs to you as much as it belongs to me." Marcus's throat tightened. His chest swelled with pride. Slowly, with a hand steady from years of service, he rose to his feet. The SEALs rose with him, and then, with every ounce of dignity, Marcus returned the salute to his son. Gasps filled the room. Parents wiped tears from their eyes. Some students on stage began clapping softly, then louder. The applause spread like wildfire. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, clapping, cheering, and shouting. "Johnson, Johnson, Johnson." The chant shook the room. The principal, unable to stop it, simply lowered his head. He knew this was no longer his ceremony. It belonged to the Johnson family. David lowered his salute, tears slipping down his face. He walked forward, shaking the principal's hand quickly, but his eyes never left his father. He held his diploma high, then pointed toward Marcus as if declaring, "This is for you, Dad." The SEALs clapped harder than anyone else, their voices carrying above the rest. They had seen Marcus on battlefields, but this moment was greater than any victory. It was not medals or glory, it was legacy. Marcus felt his eyes burn. He had trained himself never to cry, not in front of enemies, not in front of his men. But this was different. This was his son, his blood, his future. His body trembled as he whispered, "That's my boy." The crowd cheered louder. Mothers hugged their children. Fathers patted their sons on the shoulders. The power of the moment reached everyone in the hall, breaking through differences of race, status, or uniform. Even the guards, now standing in shame at the back of the hall, bowed their heads. They had wanted to remove Marcus, but now they stood in silence, knowing they had almost destroyed something sacred. David walked across the stage, diploma in hand, his steps stronger with each stride. When he reached the stairs, he didn't walk back to his seat with the other graduates. Instead, he walked straight down the aisle toward his father. The crowd parted for him. When David reached Marcus, he didn't hesitate. He threw his arms around his father, pulling him into a fierce embrace. The Marine's medals pressed against the boy's gown, clinking softly between them. The audience erupted again, some people sobbing openly. Phones flashed, recording the moment that would surely live on far beyond the walls of the auditorium. The SEALs stood taller, their chests swelling with pride for their brother. They had seen Marcus carry soldiers through gunfire, but here he was carrying something far greater, the love of a son. The principal, finally regaining his voice, spoke shakily into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "let's give a special recognition to the Johnson family." The hall thundered with applause once more. Marcus pulled back slightly, looking into his son's eyes. "I told you I'd be here," he whispered. David nodded, his face wet with tears. "I know, Dad, I never doubted you." They stood together, father and son, in front of a crowd that would never forget what they had witnessed. And yet, the silence that followed wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It wasn't even about David alone. It was about something greater, about respect, about unity, about what it truly meant to stand for family. The story wasn't finished. The final chapter still waited. The moment when dignity would be restored not just for Marcus, but for every soldier, every parent, every man or woman who had ever been told they didn't belong. The thunder of applause echoed through the auditorium, bouncing off the walls like rolling waves. Parents were still on their feet. Students on stage clapped with glowing faces, and the SEALs stood tall, their presence unshakable. But in the middle of it all stood Marcus and David, locked in an embrace that spoke louder than any words, father and son together, refusing to be broken. The principal cleared his throat again, his voice trembling as it boomed over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we celebrate not only our graduates but the families who have carried them here. And there is one family among us whose story reminds us all of what sacrifice, honor, and love truly mean." He turned his gaze toward Marcus, his expression a mixture of guilt and respect. "Sergeant Marcus Johnson, we thank you for your service, your courage, and your example, not only to your son, but to every student in this room." The audience roared with applause once more, but this time it wasn't just for David's graduation. It was for Marcus. David stepped aside slightly, letting his father stand tall as the spotlight shifted toward him. The medals on Marcus's chest glittered like fire under the bright lights. For years they had been silent reminders of war and sacrifice, but today, in this moment, they were proof of dignity reclaimed. The principal motioned for Marcus to join them on stage. At first, Marcus shook his head. "This is David's day," he said firmly. But David grabbed his father's hand, his grip tight. "Dad," David whispered, his eyes burning with pride. "It's our day. Come with me." The crowd erupted with cheers as David led his father up the steps. The SEALs followed close behind, their boots striking the floor with quiet authority. The entire hall held its breath as Marcus reached the stage. The principal handed the microphone to Marcus. For a long moment, the Marine said nothing. He stood tall, scanning the crowd, his face calm, his eyes steady. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but carried through the entire hall. "I didn't come here to be honored," he said. "I came here to honor my son." He turned slightly, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "Because no matter what medals you wear, no matter what battles you fought, your greatest victory will always be your children." The audience erupted into applause again, but Marcus raised his hand and the hall fell silent instantly. He looked toward the guards, who stood in shame at the back of the hall. "To those who doubted me, I say this: you don't get to decide who belongs. A father belongs with his child, always. No uniform, no skin color, no prejudice will ever change that truth." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was powerful. The words sank deep into every heart in the room. The SEAL with the scarred cheek stepped forward and added his own voice. "This man carried us through battles we thought we wouldn't survive. And today, he showed us again what strength really looks like. Not fists, not weapons, but the refusal to be moved from what matters most." The audience stood again, their applause thunderous, tears streaming down many faces. Parents hugged their children tighter, reminded of the simple but profound truth Marcus had spoken. The principal, humbled, extended his hand. "Sergeant Johnson," he said, "on behalf of this school, we thank you. Today, this ceremony belongs to you and your son." Marcus shook his hand, but then leaned into the microphone one last time. "No," he said, his voice deep and firm. "This day belongs to David, to every graduate here. To the future. The crowd roared with pride. David lifted his diploma high, his face glowing with emotion. The entire graduating class began chanting his name. David! 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 But the chant didn't stay with the son. Slowly it shifted. Johnson! 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 Father and son. Together. Marcus's chest swelled as he pulled David into another embrace. The SEALs clapped, their faces softening with smiles. For them, this was not just about Marcus, it was about what he represented. Brotherhood, loyalty, family. The two guards slipped quietly out of the hall, their shame complete. No one noticed their exit. No one cared. The ceremony ended not with routine applause, but with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Parents and students alike knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. As the graduates tossed their caps into the air, Marcus stood with David by his side, both of them looking up at the fluttering symbols of hope and future. The Marine had walked into the auditorium as just another father. He had been doubted, disrespected, nearly humiliated, but he left the hall as something more. Living proof that dignity cannot be taken away, not by ignorance, not by prejudice, not by anyone. And as the SEALs walked out with him, the audience still clapping, David whispered the words that would stay with Marcus forever. Dad, today wasn't just my graduation. It was yours too. Marcus smiled, his eyes wet. No, son. Today it was ours. The doors closed behind them, but the sound of the applause echoed on, and in that echo lived the truth of the day. A Marine's dignity restored. A son's pride unshaken. A room silenced then awakened. Forever.